Did you know there is a fault line 700 miles long running just off the coast, and when it moves, the ground will shake for 5 straight minutes, bridges will liquefy, and a wall of water will cross the Pacific in 15 minutes? Did you know the purest plutonium ever made on Earth was manufactured beside a river in Washington, inside a reactor so dangerous they had to build a second city just to house the people who worked there, a city that stayed secret for years? Did you know that the largest building on the planet by volume sits in a town most Americans have never heard of, and inside it, they assemble aircraft that have not seen the ground in decades? The Pacific Northwest is not the postcard you have been sold. It is not coffee shops in the rain, not tech campuses with mountain views, not flannel and fog and ferry boats gliding across the Sound. It is a subduction zone where the next great American disaster is already overdue. It is a rainforest that drinks 12 feet of water a year and grows trees taller than the Statue of Liberty. It is a buried city, a burning mountain, a lava tube so vast you could fly a drone through it and still lose signal. And it is hiding more than any single region of this country has a right to. These are 32 wild facts about the Pacific Northwest that nobody talks about. 32. The Cascadia Subduction Zone. Off the coast of Oregon and Washington, the Juan de Fuca Plate is sliding under North America at roughly 1.5 inches per year. That is the same speed your fingernails grow. For 324 years, since January 26th of 1700, it has been locked. The spring is being compressed. When it releases, the earthquake will be magnitude 9.0 or higher. The shaking will last 4 to 6 minutes. For comparison, the 1989 Loma Prieta quake that collapsed the Bay Bridge lasted 15 seconds. A quake 96 times more energetic will hit the Northwest, and the geologists who study this fault do not use the word if, they use when. 31. The Hanford Site. In 1943, the United States government seized 670 square miles of Washington desert along the Columbia River. The families who lived there, farmers, ranchers, the Wanapum people, were given 30 days to leave. What was built in their place was the B reactor, the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor. The plutonium for the Trinity test and for the bomb dropped on Nagasaki came from this building. Hanford eventually held 9 reactors. For decades, they pumped radioactive waste directly into the ground, over 450 billion gallons of contaminated liquid. Today, 177 underground tanks hold 56 million gallons of the deadliest industrial waste in the Western Hemisphere. Dozens of those tanks have leaked. The cleanup, which began in 1989, is expected to take until 2078 at a cost of over $200 billion. It is the largest environmental remediation project in human history, and most Americans have never heard of it. 30. Crater Lake. In southern Oregon, about 7,700 years ago, a 12,000-foot volcano, Mount Mazama, erupted with 42 times the force of the Mount St. Helens blast. The magma chamber emptied so completely that the mountain collapsed into itself, leaving a bowl 6 miles wide. Over centuries, rain and snowmelt filled it. Today, Crater Lake is the deepest lake in the United States, at 1,943 feet. The water is so pure, so free of sediment, that it absorbs every color of the spectrum except deep blue. Looking into it from the rim feels less like looking at water and more like staring into a hole in the world. There are no streams feeding it and no streams leaving it. The lake maintains its level through a perfect balance of precipitation and evaporation. A dead moss mat, called the Old Man of the Lake, has been floating vertically in the same spot for over 100 years. 29. The Channeled Scablands. Travel east across Washington, and you find terrain that does not match the gentle erosion of rivers. Massive gouges, 100-foot deep canyons carved through solid basalt, boulders the size of houses sitting miles from their source. For decades, geologists argued about what caused it. The answer, when it came in the 1920s from a scientist named J. Harlan Bretz, was so shocking that the scientific community spent 40 years ridiculing him. Between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, during the last ice age, a glacial dam in Montana held back a lake the size of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, Glacial Lake Missoula. When the ice dam failed, a wall of water 500 feet high, traveling at 65 miles per hour, unleashed across 4 states. It carried 10 times the flow of all the rivers on Earth combined. It reshaped the landscape in 48 hours. And it happened not once, but perhaps 40 times. Every ice dam rebuild followed by another catastrophic failure. 28. Mount St. Helens. On the morning of May 18th of 1980, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake shook the mountain. The entire north face, the largest landslide in recorded history, collapsed. 2.79 cubic kilometers of rock fell away. The sudden release of pressure caused a lateral blast, not upward but sideways, a superheated cloud of gas, ash, and pulverized rock traveling at 650 miles per hour. It flattened 230 square miles of forest. Spirit Lake was displaced 800 feet upward and became a toxic stew of mud, ash, and thousands of downed trees. Trees that, 30 years later, still float in a massive gray raft on its surface. 57 people died. The ash cloud circled the Earth in 15 days. Mount St. Helens lost 1,314 feet of elevation in under 3 minutes. 27. The Hoh Rainforest. On the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, the Hoh River Valley receives 140 to 170 inches of rain every year. To put that in perspective, Seattle, famous for its rain, gets 37 inches. The Hoh is a temperate rainforest, one of the quietest, wettest ecosystems in the contiguous United States. The trees here include Sitka spruce reaching 270 feet, and western red cedars older than the Magna Carta. The Roosevelt elk, named after Theodore Roosevelt, are the largest elk subspecies on the continent, and they graze among ferns taller than a person. Moss hangs from every branch. The forest floor is a sponge that can hold several times its weight in water. Sunlight at noon feels like twilight because the canopy absorbs nearly everything. I have stood on that trail in July, and the air smells like wet earth, cedar oil, and something ancient that does not exist anywhere else in the lower 48. 26. The Seattle Underground. After the Great Seattle Fire of 1889 burned 25 city blocks to the ground, the city made a radical decision. Instead of rebuilding at street level, they raised the streets by 1 to 2 stories, up to 22 feet in some places. The new sidewalks were built 1 floor above the old ones. For roughly a decade, pedestrians climbed ladders between street levels. Shops operated in the lower level while construction continued above. Eventually, the old ground floors were abandoned and sealed. Today, beneath Pioneer Square, an entire network of subterranean storefronts, sidewalks, and passageways sits preserved. A city buried under the city, invisible to the thousands of tourists and office workers walking above it every single day. 25. Fort Stevens. On the night of June 21st of 1942, a Japanese submarine, the I-25, surfaced off the coast of Oregon near the mouth of the Columbia River. It fired 17 shells at Fort Stevens, a United States Army base. The fort's batteries did not return fire. The commanding officer ordered the guns silent, reasoning that returning fire would give the submarine a more accurate fix on the base's position. The shells hit the coastline, a baseball field, and some telephone wires. Nobody was killed. This was the only time during World War II that a military installation on the continental United States was attacked by an enemy vessel. The submarine escaped into the Pacific, and 2 months later launched a float plane that dropped incendiary bombs on Oregon forests, the only aerial bombing of the American mainland by a foreign power in the war. 24. The Palouse. Drive through southeastern Washington in late spring, and you see hills that do not look like geology. They look like a green ocean frozen in place. The Palouse is a region of rolling loess hills, wind-blown silt deposited over tens of thousands of years, some dunes reaching 200 feet high. It is some of the richest wheat-growing soil on the planet. In the 1870s, farmers began planting here. Today, the Palouse produces some of the highest wheat yields per acre anywhere in the world. The land is so steep in places that combines have to be specially modified with self-leveling systems. From above, the patterns of cultivation look like a giant's fingerprint pressed into the earth. 23. The Boeing Everett Factory. In Everett, Washington, sits the largest building on Earth by volume, 472 million cubic feet, covering 98.3 acres. The assembly bay doors are 82 feet high. The building is so large that when it was first constructed, clouds formed inside near the ceiling, and it rained indoors until engineers installed a circulation system. Inside this building, Boeing assembles the 747, 767, 777, and 787 aircraft. The crane network above the factory floor moves along 31 miles of track. The building has its own fire department, its own medical clinic, and its own water treatment plant. It is a city inside a box, and you can drive past it on Interstate 5 without ever realizing that the airliner passing overhead was born inside the structure you just glanced at. 22. The Bridge of the Gods. The Columbia River Gorge is the only sea-level passage through the Cascade Mountains. Before modern dams, before Lewis and Clark, a natural bridge spanned the river here. Sometime around the year 1450, the Bonneville landslide, one of the largest in North American history, sent an entire mountainside crashing into the Columbia. The debris dammed the river completely. Water backed up for miles. The river eventually carved through the blockage, leaving behind the Cascade Rapids, a series of violent whitewater that took Native American fishermen generations to master. The bridge itself, a temporary land connection formed by the slide, gave the gorge its name in Klickitat legend, the Bridge of the Gods. Lewis and Clark portaged around these rapids in 1805, and they called the gorge the most dangerous stretch of water they had encountered west of the Mississippi. 21. The Oregon Vortex. In the town of Gold Hill, Oregon, sits a circular area roughly 165 feet in diameter where the rules of physics appear to break. Balls roll uphill. Brooms stand on their own. People appear to change height relative to each other when they swap positions. The owners claim it is a spherical force field where the normal gravitational and magnetic properties of Earth are distorted. Skeptics say it is an elaborate optical illusion, a crooked house built on a slope that tricks the eye into seeing level ground where none exists. The site has been a roadside attraction since 1930, and the argument about what is actually happening there has been going on almost as long. I have stood in that crooked house. Your inner ear and your eyes disagree violently, and even when you know it is a trick, your body does not believe you. 20. The Wallowa Mountains. In the northeastern corner of Oregon rise peaks that look like they belong in the Swiss Alps, not in the Pacific Northwest. The Wallowas are a fault block range, massive slabs of granite and limestone pushed upward, carved by glaciers into horns, cirques, and U-shaped valleys. Eagle Cap, the highest point at 9,572 feet, presides over a wilderness area larger than some national parks. The Nez Perce people considered these mountains sacred. Chief Joseph was born here and repeatedly refused to leave. In 1877, the United States Army forced the Nez Perce out, triggering an 1,100-mile fighting retreat that ended 40 miles from the Canadian border. The Wallowas today are called the Alps of Oregon, and the alpine lakes scattered through them, Ice Lake, Mirror Lake, Lagore Lake, stay frozen well into July. 19. The Graveyard of the Pacific. The mouth of the Columbia River, where it meets the Pacific Ocean, is one of the most dangerous navigational passages on the planet. The river pushes millions of gallons of fresh water per second into the ocean, while tides, currents, and Pacific swells push back. The result is a constantly shifting sandbar and waves that can reach 30 feet with no warning. Over 2,000 ships have wrecked here since records began in the 1790s. The Columbia River Bar, the stretch where river meets ocean, has earned its name, the Graveyard of the Pacific. The Coast Guard operates a special training school at Cape Disappointment for surf rescue in these conditions. The waves they practice in are the real thing, the same ones that have claimed fishing boats, schooners, and steamers for over 2 centuries. 18. The Cascade Volcanoes. The Cascade Range, stretching from Northern California into British Columbia, contains over a dozen major volcanoes. Oregon and Washington alone have 9 peaks over 9,000 feet. Mount Rainier at 14,411 feet is the highest, and it is considered one of the most dangerous volcanoes on Earth, not because of lava, but because its summit holds 25 glaciers and enough ice to generate lahars, volcanic mudflows, that would reach the suburbs of Tacoma and Seattle in under 2 hours. The last major Rainier eruption was 1,000 years ago. I have stood on the trails below Mount Baker and watched steam vent from its crater on a clear October morning. The mountain is not dead. None of them are. They are just resting. 17. The Roosevelt Elk. In 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt created the Mount Olympus National Monument to protect the elk that now bear his name. The Olympic Peninsula herd, isolated from other elk populations by geography, represents a unique subspecies, Cervus canadensis roosevelti. These are the largest elk in North America. Bulls can weigh 1,100 pounds and carry antlers spanning over 4 feet. Unlike their Rocky Mountain cousins, Roosevelt elk thrive in dense temperate rainforest, navigating slopes and undergrowth that would exhaust a human in minutes. The herd was down to fewer than 2,000 animals when Roosevelt acted. Today, thanks to that protected habitat, they number in the tens of thousands. The bull elk bugle during the fall rut echoes through the Hoh and Quinault valleys, a sound so alien and high-pitched that the first European explorers who heard it thought they were listening to something not quite natural. That is 16 down, 16 to go. Which fact surprised you the most so far? Drop it in the comments before we continue, and subscribe if you want to know what happens when you dig even deeper into the Pacific Northwest, because the second half is where this region stops being beautiful and starts being almost impossible to believe. 16. In the winter of 1944 and spring of 1945, the Japanese military launched over 9,000 hydrogen balloons, carrying incendiary and anti-personnel bombs across the Pacific Ocean, aimed at the American mainland. The balloons rode the jet stream, a current of high-altitude wind moving at over 100 miles per hour, something Japanese meteorologists had studied extensively. About 300 of these balloon bombs are confirmed to have reached North America. They landed as far east as Michigan, as far south as Texas, and as far north as Alaska. One bomb landed near Bly, Oregon, on May 5th of 1945. A pastor's pregnant wife and 5 children from a Sunday school class found it during a picnic. It detonated. All 6 died. They were the only civilian casualties of enemy action on the United States mainland during the entire Second World War. The United States government pressured newspapers to suppress all reporting on the balloons, and the silence held for decades so completely that most Americans still do not know it happened. 15. During the last ice age, an ice dam in Montana held back a lake containing 500 cubic miles of water. When that dam failed, and it failed repeatedly, perhaps 40 times, the water exploded westward at 65 miles per hour. Somewhere near present-day Coulee City in Washington, the flood hit a 350-foot cliff of basalt and poured over it. But this was not a normal waterfall. The water volume was so immense that the falls eroded the cliff backward, undercutting the lip and devouring rock at a rate geologists still struggle to comprehend. Today, Dry Fall stands as a fossil of that catastrophe, a crescent-shaped cliff 3.5 miles wide, 400 feet high, with no water falling over it. When it was active, it carried 10 times the flow of all the rivers on Earth. It was the largest waterfall that has ever existed on this planet. And now it is a dry scar in the desert, a rest stop on Highway 17, where tourists pull over and pose for photos without realizing that the cliff behind them once roared louder than anything alive today has ever heard. 14. Lake Chelan. In north-central Washington, is the third deepest lake in the United States at 1,486 feet. Its surface sits at about 1,100 feet above sea level, which means its bottom is 386 feet below sea level. The lake is 50.5 miles long, but never more than 1.5 miles wide, a glacial trough carved by ice, so narrow that from certain angles it looks more like a Norwegian fjord than an American lake. The upper end of Chelan is accessible only by boat, floatplane, or a hiking trail that climbs 4,000 feet through the North Cascades. The town of Stehekin sits at that upper end, population approximately 75, with no roads connecting it to the outside world. The lake water is so clear that a white disc lowered into it is visible at over 150 feet. I have jumped off a dock into Chelan in late summer, and the shock is immediate. This water was snow on a glacier about an hour ago, and it has not forgotten. 13. Beneath the streets of Portland's Old Town and Chinatown districts lies a network of underground tunnels and rooms, the Shanghai Tunnels. From roughly the 1850s through the early 20th century, these passageways connected the basements of bars, hotels, and brothels directly to the Willamette River docks. The practice of Shanghaiing, kidnapping men and forcing them into service aboard ships, was rampant in Portland. A working man would have a drink at a saloon. A trapdoor would open beneath his stool, and he would wake up the next morning on a vessel bound for Shanghai or Hong Kong, already at sea, already crew, with no legal recourse. Estimates of the number of men shanghaied from Portland range from hundreds into the thousands. The tunnels were sealed for decades after the practice ended. Today, guided tours take visitors through the surviving sections, and I have walked those passages myself. The walls still have names scratched into them, men who wanted someone, anyone, to know they were down there. 12. In the winter of 1998 through 1999, Mount Baker, a volcano in the North Cascades of Washington, received 1,140 inches of snow. That is 95 feet. It is a single-season world record. The road to the ski area was buried so deeply that crews used bulldozers and dynamite to clear it. The snowpack was dense enough at the summit that it persisted through the summer and into the following winter. For context, a typical heavy snowfall season at a major ski resort might see 300 to 400 inches. Mount Baker tripled that. The mountain's weather station recorded whiteout conditions for so many consecutive days that some local residents stopped counting. Mount Baker is not the tallest volcano in the Cascades, not even close. But the moisture-laden air coming off the Pacific hits its slopes and rises. And when air rises, it cools. And when it cools, it drops everything it is carrying. The geography makes Baker a snow trap, and the winter of 98 to 99 was the trap springing shut. 11. Hell's Canyon, on the border of Oregon and Idaho, is the deepest river gorge in North America. At its maximum, the canyon walls rise 7,993 feet above the Snake River below. The Grand Canyon, by comparison, is about 6,000 feet deep at its deepest point. Hell's Canyon is deeper by nearly 2,000 feet. Yet, almost nobody knows it exists. It is remote, accessible by a handful of gravel roads and a long hiking trail, and it sits in a corner of the country that does not draw crowds. The Nez Perce people have lived in and around this canyon for thousands of years. The first recorded descent by boat was in 1895, and the party nearly died. The Snake River through Hell's Canyon is a sequence of Class 4 and 5 rapids, some of the most violent whitewater in the country. The deepest part of the canyon, below He Devil Mountain, plunges so far below the rim that the river at the bottom is invisible from the top. You can stand on the edge and see nothing but canyon wall descending into shadow, and somewhere down there, a river is still cutting. 10. In the 1990s, the Pacific Northwest became the center of one of the most bitter environmental battles in American history, the Timber Wars. At the center of it all was the northern spotted owl, a bird nobody had paid much attention to until scientists realized its fate was tied to the fate of old-growth forests. A single pair of spotted owls requires roughly 2,000 acres of old growth to hunt and breed. By the late 1980s, decades of logging had reduced those forests to fragments. In 1990, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service listed the spotted owl as threatened. A federal judge shut down logging on millions of acres of public land. The logging communities of Oregon and Washington towns built on timber for 100 years collapsed. Mills closed, families left. The conflict was not abstract. It was jobs versus a species, and both sides lost something. The spotted owl population continued to decline anyway, not just because of logging, but because a new threat had arrived. Barred owls, more aggressive and more adaptable, moved into the Northwest and began outcompeting the spotted owl for territory. The logging stopped, but the decline did not. That is 10 down, 6 to go. And this is where the Pacific Northwest stops being strange and starts being almost impossible to believe. The biggest ones are still ahead, so drop your favorite facts so far in the comments. Subscribe and like if you want to keep exploring the hidden geography of America. Now, let us finish this. 9. The waters of the Salish Sea, the inland waterways between Washington and British Columbia, are home to a population of killer whales unlike any other on Earth. The southern resident orcas, 73 individuals as of the most recent count, eat almost exclusively Chinook salmon. They do not eat seals. They do not eat sea lions. Their entire culture, their hunting techniques, their social structure revolves around a single species of fish, and that fish is disappearing. The Chinook runs of the Columbia, the Snake, the Fraser, all of them are a fraction of what they were a century ago. The orcas are starving. Mothers are losing calves. Scientists have documented grieving behavior, a mother carrying her dead calf on her head for 17 days, refusing to let it sink. The southern residents are down from a peak of 98 individuals in 1995. They are one bad salmon year away from functional extinction. The Salish Sea without them would still be beautiful. It would also be silent, in a way that cannot be measured in decibels. 8. On the high slopes of the Olympic Mountains lives an animal that exists nowhere else on Earth, the Olympic marmot. It is a grizzly-sized ground squirrel, honey-colored with a whistle that echoes across the alpine meadows. It hibernates for 7 to 8 months of the year. During its brief active season, it does almost nothing but eat, sunbathe, and interact with other marmots in colonies that can span dozens of acres. The Olympic marmot's entire global range is about 150 square miles, the high country of Olympic National Park. There are roughly 2,000 of them left. Coyotes, which did not historically reach the high Olympics, have moved into marmot habitat as the climate warms, and the marmots have not adapted. They do not recognize the predator because they did not evolve alongside it. When a coyote appears, the marmot sometimes does not even whistle. It just watches and waits and does not know enough to run. 7. About 2,000 years ago, a vent on the south flank of Mount St. Helens opened and released a river of molten basalt that flowed for nearly 9 miles. As the surface of the flow cooled and hardened, the lava inside continued moving, eventually draining out and leaving behind a hollow tube. Today, the Ape Caves, named after a Boy Scout troop, not an ape, are the longest continuous lava tube in the continental United States, at over 2.5 miles. The upper section requires scrambling over boulder piles in total darkness. The temperature inside stays at about 42 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The walls are coated with lava sickles. The upper section requires scrambling over boulder piles in total darkness. The temperature inside stays at about 42 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The walls are coated with lava sickles, drips of once molten rock that cooled mid-fall and now hang from the ceiling like stone icicles. I have walked the lower cave with a headlamp, and the darkness is the kind you feel on your skin. Absolute, without a single photon of natural light. When you turn off the lamp, you understand what it means to be underground, in a way that a photograph cannot convey. 6. When the ice dam at Glacial Lake Missoula broke, the floodwaters scoured the earth with such force that they left behind ripple marks, not ripples in a stream bed, but giant waves of sediment, up to 35 feet high and spaced hundreds of feet apart. From the ground, they look like rolling hills. From the air, they look exactly like the ripples you see on a beach after the tide goes out, enlarged 10,000 times. And from space, using satellite imagery, you can trace them for miles across eastern Washington. These are the largest current ripples ever discovered. They are fossilized turbulence, the shape of the flood itself, frozen in the earth. Geologists in the early 20th century refused to believe that a single flood could have created them. They were wrong. The flood was real, it was catastrophic, and the evidence is written across 4 states in a language of sediment that took science half a century to learn how to read. 5. Lake Pend Oreille, in the panhandle of northern Idaho, is one of the deepest lakes in the United States at 1,158 feet. During the Second World War, the United States Navy chose this lake, hundreds of miles from any ocean, surrounded by mountains, as a submarine testing facility. The reason was acoustic. The lake's depth, combined with its freshwater composition and the surrounding topography, created an underwater sound profile so quiet that sonar testing produced cleaner data here than anywhere else in American waters. The Navy built a research station at Bayview, Idaho in 1942. Today, it is the Naval Surface Warfare Center Carderock Division's Acoustic Research Detachment. The submarines they test here are scale models, but not small ones. Some are over 90 feet long, 1/4 scale, because acoustic physics does not scale linearly, and they need a certain size for the data to translate. The lake is deep enough and military enough that civilian boats are restricted from certain areas. You can be fishing on a mountain lake in Idaho and suddenly have a submarine pass beneath your hull. 4. On June 6 of 1889, a cabinet maker named John Back in Seattle was heating glue over a gasoline fire in a woodworking shop at the corner of Front and Madison. The pot of glue boiled over. The gasoline ignited. The fire spread to the wooden building, then to the next, then to the next. By the time it was over, the Great Seattle Fire had destroyed 25 city blocks, practically the entire central business district. Every building was wood. The water mains were wooden too, and they burned. The fire department could not pump water. The fire burned for 18 hours. When it was done, the city did not just rebuild. It raised the streets by as much as 22 feet, creating an entire buried city beneath the new one. The single glue pot in a cabinet shop erased a city and created another one on top of it. That new city became the Seattle of the 20th century, and the ghost of the old one, the one the glue pot burned, is still down there. Sidewalks, storefronts, doorways to nowhere, waiting in the dark beneath Pioneer Square. 3. Mount Rainier rises 14,411 feet above sea level. It is visible from downtown Seattle on clear days, floating on the horizon like a mirage. But the mountain is not the postcard. 25 named glaciers cling to its slopes, the largest glacial system on any single peak in the contiguous United States. The summit holds enough ice and snow that if it were to melt suddenly, the volume would bury the Puyallup Valley 100 feet deep in mud. This is not hypothetical. About 5,600 years ago, a massive lahar, the Osceola mudflow, swept down from Rainier's summit. It traveled over 60 miles to Puget Sound, burying everything in its path. The towns of Ording, Sumner, Puyallup, and parts of Tacoma sit directly on top of that old mudflow. The mountain will do it again. The United States Geological Survey has installed lahar warning sirens in the valleys below Rainier. Residents practice evacuation drills. The schools have plans. The mountain is not dead. I have stood at Paradise, just above the timberline, on a clear day when the summit looked close enough to touch. And the silence up there is the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, and aware that the ground beneath your feet is not as permanent as it pretends to be. 2. On the morning of May 18th of 1980, a 30-year-old volcanologist named David Johnston was camped on a ridge 6 miles from Mount St. Helens. He had been warning for weeks that the mountain was going to blow, not upward as volcanoes typically do, but laterally, sideways, a bullet of gas and rock aimed directly at the ridge where he was standing. At 8:32 in the morning, the north face of the mountain collapsed. The lateral blast erupted. Johnston's final transmission over the radio was 3 words: Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. The blast reached his position at over 650 miles per hour. His body was never recovered. The ridge where he died is now named Johnston Ridge, and the observatory built there looks directly into the crater he predicted. The eruption killed 57 people, including Johnston. It removed the top 1,314 feet of the mountain. It proved that the quietest-looking volcanoes are sometimes the most violent, because they bottle their pressure sideways instead of venting it upward. And by the time you see what is coming, it is already moving faster than sound. 1. We started this countdown with the Cascadia Subduction Zone. We end here. On January 26th of 1700, at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, a magnitude 9 earthquake ruptured the entire 700-mile fault off the Pacific Northwest coast. The evidence comes from Japan, where a so-called orphan tsunami, a tsunami with no preceding earthquake felt locally, struck the coast hours later, destroying villages and drowning people who had no warning and no explanation. It comes from ghost forests along the Washington and Oregon coastlines, stands of dead cedar and spruce that had been suddenly submerged by the land dropping 6 feet. The ghosts are still standing, their skeletal trunks visible at low tide, killed in a single night 3 centuries ago. The Cascadia Fault has ruptured at least 41 times in the last 10,000 years. The average interval is roughly 240 years. It has been 324 years since the last one. The spring has been compressing every single day since 1700. Geologists now say there is a 37% chance of a magnitude 9+ earthquake in the next 50 years. The Pacific Northwest is not just hiding something, it is waiting. After these 32 facts about the Pacific Northwest, which one surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe and like if you want to keep uncovering the hidden geography of America. And I will see you in the next one.